Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Before I proceed with my role as the host for our event, I would like to acknowledge that my home institution, the University of British Columbia, an affiliation with which has secured resources to host this roundtable today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Some of you are joining us from many different locations where life is governed by settler colonial logics and other oppressive structures. And I hope that our work in some capacity or another can resist such violence. I'm very glad to be in community with you all today and among other, think of ways that we can accomplish that. My name is Ervin Malakaj. I'm an assistant professor of German studies and affiliate faculty at the Center for European Studies at the University of British Columbia. Currently, I am the co-chair of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies scholarly interest group, Central East South European Cinemas. And in conjunction with my work there, Dr. Zoran Samardzija and I created this roundtable series to highlight and amplify work by scholars working in these areas. Our aim is rather simple, really. Forthcoming or recent published scholarship, in our opinion, deserves a really good audience. And these roundtables are intended to structure that. So to this end, we invite you to reach out to Zoran and I if you would like to be part of future roundtables in which we can get to feature your individual or collective work in some capacity. As the infrastructure for the network, so we call it New Work in Central Eastern and South European Cinema Studies grows, we'll be sure to keep you posted. You can find some more info about the network on our website, and I'm going to post a link in the chat. Some of you might know it already via the registration page for the event today. We'd particularly welcome if you are interested in being part of our email list. We are currently curating an email list, and you can find out more information about that list on our website. Today, we are very happy that the masterminds behind two fantastic books are able to join us and present their work. Before I introduce them, I wanted to just turn to a couple of housekeeping components for today. Our speakers will present their work, and each book will get about 20 minutes or so of presentation time. Thereafter, I'll open up the floor for questions, comments, and discussion. Please keep in mind that the event is recorded. I will invite live questions and comments. This means that you can unmute yourself and pose the question, or if you wish to submit a question in comment or chat, this is of course perfectly welcome. Sometimes the problem is because you all are very chatty, which I welcome and appreciate and love, the chat gets very crowded. So in case I skip you, this happened once, please, I accept my apology in advance and just ping me somehow once again, and I'll make sure to get to your question or comment. It is not intended, intentionally. It's perfectly my own fault. So hostilities on that note will not be tolerated in any capacity, and I and my colleagues here deserve the right to limit participation to this event in the case of hostility. I want to make sure that that's very explicit. For now, I'd like to ask you to mute your microphones, and if you prefer to turn off your camera, it's very important that your microphone remain muted throughout. There are a couple of situations that have occurred at Zoom events. Y'all witnessed that too. I've accidentally participated in some weird stuff where I thought my microphone was off. It was not, and everyone heard what I was doing. So let's just, and it's recorded and it's posted online. So just keep that in mind. It's up to you to moderate that on your end. I think we have some capacity to mute you behind here, but I'd rather not sort of, engage in that activity. I ask you to do some of that surveillance on your own. So on this note, our first presenter is Dr. Hester Baer. Dr. Baer is professor of German and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Maryland, where she also serves as core faculty member in the Comparative Literature program and is an affiliate in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Baer is the author of Dismantling the Dream Factory, Gender, German Cinema, and the Post-War Quest for New Film Language, 2009, and the co-editor of several volumes, including German Women's Writing in the 21st Century from 2015, and a special issue of the journal Camera Obscura on women's film authorship in neoliberal times, Revisiting Feminism and German Cinema 2018. Her monograph on West Germany's first feminist film, Ulla Stöckel's The Cat Has 9 Lives from 1968, will be published in a series German Film Classics with Camden House, spring 2022. Baer is currently completing a 3-year term as co-editor of the journal Feminist German Studies, and she's now serving as co-editor of the German Quarterly. Her book, German Cinema in the Age of Neoliberalism, appeared in a series, Film Culture in Transition with Amsterdam University Press earlier this year. And Dr. Baer's presentation today will pertain to that book. I want to make sure to highlight that this book, and I made sure to put this in a registration link for the event today, that the book is available open access as well. And I'm going to post that link in the chat. You can find out more about the book there. I invite you all to help me welcome Dr. Baer.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am currently speaking from Silver Spring, Maryland, on the lands of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. And I really like to thank Ervin and Zoran for organizing today's event and this whole series of roundtables on Central, Eastern, and Southern European cinema studies. I had the chance to watch recordings of the previous roundtables, and I just think it's such a great format, and I really learned a lot from it. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm particularly happy to be here today for this discussion with Maria and Beverly, because I think there are quite a few intersections between our two books and really lots to talk about. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I'm excited too, because this is my first talk about this book since it was published, kind of due to our current circumstances. I haven't had the opportunity to do this yet, so we'll see if I can pull all the threads together. And I wanted to start by offering a definition. Neoliberalism is a messy term, and in the book, I kind of actually identify this messiness as useful in some way for considering the kind of suturing together of contradictory and paradoxical qualities that I think characterizes contemporary cinema and maybe contemporary German cinema in particular. And likewise, I draw on a pretty diverse range of theories of and about neoliberalism in kind of framing and setting up my own approach. So I actually like the messiness, and I don't really like to boil it down, but I also recognize that the slipperiness of this term neoliberalism can lead to some misunderstandings or kind of misapprehensions. And so here's one brief definition that I offer in the introduction of the book. Neoliberalism designates the notion that the free market should serve as the guiding force of all human activity. Originating as a theory of political economy, neoliberalism has come to identify a range of historical developments, emergent governmental practices, and discursive repertoires operating in conjunction to enhance corporate profit and delegitimate the social. So those are some components of the kind of working definition of neoliberalism that I just wanted to offer before I get started today. And just to put this in the context of cinema specifically, neoliberalism financializes all spheres of life. And its effects on cinema, therefore, have been especially profound, and just some kind of keywords to keep in mind. So technological change, deregulation and privatization of broadcasting, media conglomeration, the strengthening of global Hollywood. These are all aspects of neoliberal restructuring that have had a particularly strong impact on smaller national cinemas, and I would include German cinema there, although, you know, that's maybe something that can be put into question. But I'm also interested in this book, not only in these kind of material dimensions of restructuring, but also how this restructuring underpins shifts in formal, aesthetic, and generic traits, i.e. how films themselves respond to the marketization of cinema by registering, affirming, and or contesting neoliberalism in multiple and contradictory ways. And so I have some slides to share here. There we go. So in this presentation today, I'm going to start with an example in order to kind of illustrate some of the basic premises of my book and the way it seeks to reframe German film history. And following this example, I will talk a bit about what I see as the main contributions that the book makes, situate it relative to previous scholarship, and briefly discuss my aspirations for the kind of critical framework that I aim to develop for thinking through the German cinema of neoliberalism. Okay. So in the concluding episode of Wim Wenders' 1982 German-Portuguese co-production, The State of Things, the German film director Friedrich Monroe tracks down, I almost said more now, it's a play, obviously. Friedrich Monroe tracks down the Hollywood producer Gordon, who is hiding out from loan sharks in a mobile home parked on the Sunset Strip. Monroe has traveled to LA from Portugal to find the absent producer in the hopes that he will restore financing to Monroe's bankrupt film. With its story about a German director shooting a Hollywood financed picture with an international cast on location in Portugal, The State of Things weaves a tale of national and transnational cinema in which conflicts between art and commerce and between authorial vision and the mandate to entertain play out in protracted negotiations over production and financing. At stake in these negotiations is Monroe's choice to shoot his film in black and white. As his cinematographer explains, quote, "Life is in color, but black and white is more realistic," end of quote, as well as the film's fragmentary elliptical narrative and its slow pacing, all qualities associated with European art cinema. As the mobile home careens around the streets of nighttime Los Angeles, Gordon summarizes the conflicts that underpin Wenders' film. Quote, "If I would have shot that same film with an American director and an American cast in color, I'm sitting on the top of the world in 6 months. All you had to do is just, you've got to have a story, Friedrich. Cinema is not about life going by. People don't want to see that." End of quote. Alluding to the rise of global Hollywood and the concomitant imperative to create films with the broadest possible commercial appeal, Gordon's statement points to the increasing saturation of culture by economy in the early 1980s and its direct implications for German cinema. With its staging of opposed conceptions of what cinema is about, The State of Things narrativizes the significant debates taking place in the Federal Republic at this time around the role of cinema in the promotion and legitimation of national culture and the place of state support in underwriting filmmaking. Wenders' film situates these local debates in the context of transformations at stake for cinema at large, including the possibilities for cinematic representation posed by the emergence of new technologies and the globalization of media industries. With its spectacular ending, and that's what you see on the slide, featuring the symbolic death of the male filmmaker who films his own murder, The State of Things has been received as a narrative about the demise of the auteur-driven New German cinema, but it is also more broadly construed a key parable of German cinema's neoliberal turn, and this is how I kind of set it up in the first chapter of the book. Gordon's exhortation that people don't want to see the reality of life going by in the cinema echoes a similar statement made by the East German film student Ralph Peschke in Iris Guzner's 1980 DEFA film, All My Girls. When he first learns of the film school thesis project he has been assigned, a television documentary about an all-female work brigade in a Berlin light bulb factory, Ralph is outraged. And this is a quote, "The people don't want to see themselves. They'll turn the channel. My God, brigades. What do I know about them? And even worse, they're women." Ralph's statement alludes to the widespread fatigue among GDR audiences at the project of socialist realism, with its depictions on screen of collective solidarity, the worker as hero, and the experience of everyday life, which led viewers to turn away from East German film and television in the 1980s. Like Wenders, Guzner employs the self-reflexive device of a film within a film to stage a narrative about cinema's transitional status around 1980. And I see that Jenny Creech is in the audience. I'm very indebted in my analysis here to her analysis of the film. And she, I think, uses the same quote here as an epigraph for her chapter on Guzner's film. So while the state of things foregrounds the marketization of cinema beginning to take hold in the Federal Republic, All My Girls foregrounds the shifting terrain of representation at DEFA during a period of increased economic pressure due to the conflict between state-mandated ideological and aesthetic principles on the one hand, and the project of popular filmmaking on the other. As Ralph Peschke's proclamation, and even worse, They're Women, emphasizes, All My Girls specifically underscores the implication of gender, including male authorship and the representation of women, in the ideological, formal, and economic transformation of cinema, developing a systematic focus on storytelling and women's relation to narrative that also underpins Wenders' film. Considering the commonalities of these two apparently quite dissimilar films sheds light on the specific contexts that shape the transformation of German cinema on both sides of the wall, making visible the particular trajectory of encroaching neoliberalization in both East and West Germany, home to a significant national cinema tradition that came under new pressure and scrutiny beginning in the early 1980s. Wenders' is The State of Things and Guzner's All My Girls narrativize the beginning of the end of the representational projects of post-war art cinema and socialist realism, at the same time that they exemplify key tendencies of these projects. Symptomatic texts for the moment of crisis, both films hold in tension competing conceptions of what cinema is and should be. So I just wanted to begin with this example to kind of give a basic sense of the way that the book kind of sets up this narrative of neoliberalization and thinks about how this narrative is working across different temporal and geopolitical divides. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second. So turning now to kind of some of the broader aims of the book and contributions of the book, why German cinema? And I thought that this question might be particularly pertinent to this series of roundtables about Central, Eastern, and Southern European cinemas. So one of today's strongest global economies, Germany has always been home to a vital film industry, despite the vicissitudes of its history since the birth of film. Producing domestically popular films alongside of internationally successful art cinema throughout most of its history, Germany presents a particularly interesting case study for examining the impact on contemporary cinema of these developments that I've been mentioning, so increased globalization, the restructuring of the world economy, geopolitical realignment, technological change, shifting conceptions of gender, citizenship, and national identity, as well as the homogenizing influence of Hollywood. However, as I argue in the book, and this is one of the key points that I really want to draw out for today's conversation, German cinema ultimately constitutes more than just a case study for understanding the transformation of film in the contemporary period. In many ways, it may be conceptualized as the cinema of neoliberalism par excellence. And I want to just spend a little bit of time outlining why I think that's the case. So German cinema provides a particularly stark example of cinematic neoliberalization and a key site for analyzing the shifts it entailed, not least because of the unique social, political, and economic context that underpinned filmmaking in divided Germany. Cinema in both East and West Germany was largely exempt from market mechanisms throughout the post-war period, when state sponsorship promoted a culture of cinema that took precedence over economic concerns, albeit with different ideological goals and objectives and consequences in the Federal Republic and the GDR. The abrupt reversal of this hierarchy that took place in the early 1980s in both Germanys, following the economic crisis of the 1970s and the concomitant erosion of autonomous spheres of cultural production, and this is a phenomenon that I locate on both sides of the wall, starts to bring the emergent German cinema of neoliberalism into sharp focus. So already in the 1970s, West Germany served as kind of the ground for Michel Foucault's theorization of neoliberal governmentality, whose roots lie in a critique of the historical variant of German neoliberalism known as ordoliberalism. In the introduction to the book, I spent some time kind of like trying to unpack a little bit this particular trajectory of ordoliberalism and neoliberalism through the course of the 20th century in Germany. Foucault emphasizes the novelty of West Germany as a state whose legitimacy was grounded on the exercise of economic freedom, a corrective to the anti-liberalism of National Socialism. As subsequent commentators have noted, the market orientation of German reunification under the leadership of Helmut Kohl sped processes of privatization and corporatization, placing Germany, and especially the territory of the former GDR, at the forefront of neoliberalization in Europe. Thus, the peculiar history of West Germany as a ground zero of neoliberal ideas at mid-century was followed by the exceptional experience of East Germany as the vanguard of global neoliberalism at the turn of the new millennium. And it's this kind of historical conjuncture that's crucial to considering the transformation of cinema during this period. Since reunification, Germany has assumed a central role in the economic and political life of Europe, another reason to consider its cinema as emblematic for the age of neoliberalism. Debates over the idea, meaning, and worth of cinema in Germany during the last 4 decades, and this is what I kind of try to demonstrate with the way these meta-cinematic films within films of The State of Things and All My Girls stage these debates within the diegesis of the film itself. These kind of debates function as a seismograph of cultural neoliberalization in the German context. Notably, the domestic market share of German cinema has been on the rise throughout the period that I track in the book, which is the 40 years between 1980 and 2010. But this domestic market share has generally remained far below the worldwide average of 35% market share for domestic productions, reflecting that German cinema is kind of an internally divided cinema that has struggled for all kinds of reasons, some of which I try to pursue in the book, to hold its ground with local audiences, particularly when competing with Hollywood. The case of Germany diverges very sharply in this regard from France, for example, which defied Hollywood's New World Order, as Jonathan Buxbaum writes in his book Exception Taken, and staved off the shriveling of its domestic film industry in the age of neoliberalism with protectionist policy initiatives, international lobbying on behalf of cultural sovereignty, and a spirited defense of national cinema. In Germany, by contrast, government and industry commentators have defined the worth of a film largely by its capacity to make money, reshaping cultural policy to reflect this commercial imperative. In this context, other functions of cinema, for example, as a site of cultural representation and aesthetic experimentation, remain relevant only insofar as they can be monetized and are measurable as components of a film's profit motive. though cultural representation and aesthetic form obviously still remain central to the aspirations of filmmakers and to the reception context of audiences. Finally, and this is kind of like the final reason I'll enumerate for why I think German cinema marks an exemplary case of cinematic neoliberalization. German cinema's status as the preeminent cinema of neoliberalism derives from Germany's unique social, political, and economic history in the 20th century. The history of partition and unification, which is also the history of the failed mass utopias of capitalism and communism. If we understand sort of the social market economy version of capitalism that was proliferating in the second half of the 20th century and that neoliberalism then foreclosed upon. This paved the way then for processes of accelerated neoliberalization in Germany, while also making these processes distinctly visible, not least to the camera eye. For it is not only via industrial transformations, but precisely through its formal and aesthetic characteristics, its archiving of change, and its imaging of transformations in subjectivity and ordinary life that German cinema exemplifies and represents the neoliberal turn. So in addition to charting the neoliberal turn in German cinema, this book kind of tries to rethink some other commonplaces in German film studies. Most histories of recent German film have foregrounded the Caesura of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, viewing the 1980s as a dead decade for filmmaking and emphasizing the trope of reunification in post-wall cinema. By contrast, I shift the focus to 1980, a significant turning point in the world economy, as the key year of transition for German cinema. And I argue that the intensification of advanced capitalism is in many ways more significant than German reunification for understanding recent German film history. Reading films from East, West, and post-unification Germany together, the book highlights aesthetic and thematic continuities across diverse modes and genres that its focus on neoliberalism makes visible. And in this regard, I join recent approaches to rethinking German cinema within the context of transnationalism, Europeanization, and globalization. While I highlight the breakdown of conventional designations of the nation in global capitalism, I also assert the ongoing significance of national cinema as a crucial category for mapping the neoliberal turn. And my analysis aims to kind of rethink the spatio-temporal boundaries and relational networks through which German cinema has been conventionally categorized. And related to the previous point, I suggest that the conventional paradigms through which we continue to apprehend cinema, including this nation-state framework and the art house popular divide specifically, can no longer really signify in the same way in the context of neoliberalism. In this regard, my feminist approach to the cinema of neoliberalism is crucial for establishing a stronger account of the way the political agendas attached to German cinema dovetail with economic transformations. Drawing on feminist and queer theory helps me to attend to the ways in which recent German films reinforce and contest neoliberalism's co-optation and depoliticization of feminism, anti-racism and multiculturalism, LGBTQ movements, and class-based struggle. By emphasizing a feminist approach, I underscore not only the necessity of analyzing neoliberalism as a gendered cultural formation, but also the renewed significance of feminist theory for cinema and media studies in the 21st century. And I definitely think that's something that Beverly and Maria's book and my book share in common. And I'm coming to a close here. I got my timer going and I realize I'm a little over time now, so I apologize for that. So I just want to say a quick word about sort of the methodological framework. So Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism has provided a particularly significant framework for my analysis. And I have to thank Carrie Smith, who I think is in the audience as well, for telling me, like, you have to read this book a number of years ago. She was right. The formulation of Cruel Optimism helps to explain the psychosocial impact of the historical developments that I explore in the book, illuminating how neoliberalism contributes, last page, to the recasting of subjectivities, fantasies, and identities in the contemporary era. It's, yeah, so tragic that Lauren Berlant has recently died. I just have to mention that here, just for closing on, I think, one of our most important contemporary thinkers' trajectories. So cruel optimism describes a relation that's really at the heart of neoliberal cultural practices, which foster self-care and self-improvement, lionize wealth and celebrity, and promote what Stuart Hall has called the necessary fiction that ordinary people may become rich and famous through extraordinary or unconventional paths. And this is something that we see, as a trope in reality TV, as well as in a lot of contemporary films. At the same time, Berlant suggests how the rise of neoliberalism is not only recorded by cinema and other media forms that archive what is being lost, but is also accompanied by the emergence of new aesthetic forms that attend to the pervasive precariousness and crisis that characterize the present. And here's another connection that I see to Beverly and Maria's book. The multiple and often contradictory valences of contemporary culture, recording, manufacturing consent for, and contesting neoliberalism, form the nexus of my analysis of recent German cinema. And in conclusion, I just wanted to show a couple of images and kind of offer a brief note on the scope of the book. So each of my 6 chapters deliberately pairs films across geopolitical and or temporal and or sort of high-low art house popular divides in order to establish sometimes unexpected forms of relationality and to bring into focus how the context of neoliberalism opens up new perspectives on German film history, production, and aesthetics. And I deliberately take a kind of non-chronological approach. I engage in very close readings of films in order to emphasize how they're contingent upon, but also not wholly determined by the neoliberal repertoire. And to just give a sense of some of the topics and films that I talk about, I focus on here the films of ordinary life and kind of the resonance of DEFA filmmaking practices, also in contemporary cinema. Here I focus on the resonance of the 1970s political feminist queer filmmaking in contemporary cinema, and constellations of gender, intimacy, and genre across temporal boundaries and sort of forms and genres of German cinema. I talk about labor, money, and debt with films of migration, which sadly didn't make it into my slideshow because I ran out of time. And then I also look at global blockbusters from location Germany, as you can see here. So I'm going to end the slideshow now and pass things over to Beverly and Maria.
Thank you so very much, Hester. Our second talk is by Doctors Maria Stehle and Beverly Weber. Give me just 1 second. I have to highlight Maria and highlight Beverly somehow. I'll introduce them and then I'll figure it out on a technical end of things. So Dr. Stehle is a professor of German and co-chair of the interdisciplinary program in Cinema Studies at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Her publications include 3 monographs entitled Ghetto Voices in Contemporary German Cultures from 2012, Awkward Politics, The Technologies of Pop Feminist Activism with Carrie Smith from 2016, and Precarious Intimacies, The Politics of Touch in Contemporary European Cinema with Beverly Weber 2020. She also published various book chapters and articles in the fields of German, media, film, and gender studies. Her new book project is entitled Plans, Places, and Power Towards Social and Environmental Justice in Contemporary German Literature and Film. Let me also introduce Dr. Beverly Weber, who is Professor of German Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her first book, Violence and Gender in the New Europe, Islam in German Culture from 2013, examines racist and Islamophobic responses to gender violence in German politics and news media, as well as Muslim women's challenges to gendered violence and racism in literature, art, and popular media. She has published widely on racism and gender, Islam, and refugee migration in contemporary Germany, as well as on racism and whiteness in academia. She's currently working on a monograph on the politics of hospitality and cultural production by those who have entered Germany as refugees. Dr. Weber currently serves as a steering committee member for the DDGC, is part of the DDGC Mutual Aid Group, and is the incoming editor of Feminist German Studies. Dr. Stehle and Weber will present their monograph, Precarious Intimacies, The Politics of Touch in Contemporary European Cinema. And I want to mention that their book too is available in open access. And I want to post this in the chat. Some of you know this already, of course, but I just want to make sure to here at this point, express my gratitude to both Dr. Weber and Dr. Stehle, but then also Dr. Baer for their open access-ness. I think this is an important feature of their texts and deserves a special thank you. So I will pass on the mic, and in the meantime, just give me 1 second to try to figure out how to highlight both of you. But go ahead.
Hi all, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I have the strangest thing that has happened and my computer is completely shut down. So I'm going to restart and re-enter, and Maria, you can go ahead and start as much as you can.
Yes, I can also very quickly get our PowerPoint up, but first I want to thank Ervin and Zoran for inviting us. And we are in a very similar position as Hester, that we have actually not talked about this book because it also came out during the pandemic. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, and we're very excited here to be talking to you. We want to also begin by acknowledging where we're speaking from. So wait a second, now all my things have gone too. I'm speaking to you today from Knoxville, the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, specifically the traditional territory of the Tsalagi peoples, now Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and the United Chitowa Band of Cherokee Indians, and the Tsoyaha peoples. So when Beverly gets her computer back up, she will also introduce herself in this way. But in the meantime, I want to also I can put our PowerPoint up. Beverly was supposed to do that, but I have that as well. So I'm going to share the presentation with you here. Okay. 1 second. Oops. Now I'm seeing. Okay. Can you see this? But you're probably seeing our notes as well, aren't you? Yeah, let me see.
We can see it, and it's perfectly fine if the notes are there.
Yeah, okay.
I can't read them, so.
Okay, yeah, because those are the ones for us to talk. But the notes will have to be there, I believe, because otherwise we can't really go through the notes. Okay, so we wanted to start very briefly by talking about how this collaboration began. Beverly and I have known each other since graduate school, and we've started collaborating then, and we've co-written articles before that. And then I was teaching a class actually on European cinema. And in the context of this class, I noticed that there was so so many close-ups of touch, of skin, of intimacies and sex on the screen. Also, my students noticed that. And then I thought, is there a way to read this politically beyond just maybe the commercial or sensationalist? Is there something else going on in these intimacies, also aesthetically? So I started to talk to Beverly, which is what I always do when I find something interesting, and some of my other collaborators. And Beverly at the same time also worked on projects connected to Yoko Tabata. Oh, there she is. Now she can talk herself about the project she was working on that then connected to our book. Do you want to talk about this, Beverly? We are at the slide here.
Sure. I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
So we, 2 years of Zooming, and this hasn't happened yet. Perfect timing for us supposed to talk. So we were noticing that a lot of the struggles we had, productive struggles, but as we were thinking about these films, were similar to some of the things I've been thinking about in the works of Yoko Tabata and Emine Zeki Özdamar. And in particular, questions that had to do with, how do we think about intimacy, touch, care, joy, all these things that we often want to validate from a feminist perspective in the context of all the violent perspectives in which these films are also located, including racialized contexts and gendered politics. And these dilemmas seem to answer in part, or clarified at least for us in part, through this framework of precarious intimacies. Maria, did you want me to go ahead and switch to sharing from my screen as well?
Yeah, actually, that might be better. Yeah, let's do that because we have that more worked out. So I'm going to stop my sharing and Beverly's going to share, and then we'll keep going.
Okay, here we go. Thank you for your patience, everybody. And let me also, since I didn't get a chance to do this earlier, thanks for your patience. Let me also acknowledge where I speak from, which is the University of Colorado, whose 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and homelands of the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Ute, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. And to further acknowledge that the current lands of Colorado are historically tied to at least 45 additional contemporary tribal nations. So we wanted to here just read, this is the only piece that will actually read directly from the book, but read a brief description of this particular scene to provide us a bit of a concrete example that hopefully will help illustrate what we're talking about in this book. So in the 2005 film Unveiled, which is directed by Angelina Macarone, the central female character, Fariba, passes as her male friend, Siamak, to remain in Germany after she has been denied temporary residence as an asylum seeker. In a central scene that takes place in a produce processing plant, Fariba's German co-worker, Anna, flirts with Fariba in the changing rooms after she's had to hide during a check for illegal workers. Still wearing her hairnet, Anna mixed stereotypical small talk about headscarves and veils in Iran that is interwoven with Fariba's explanation of why their employer cannot legally hire Siamak or Fariba as Siamak. As Fariba lights Anna's cigarette, the camera frames the two tightly for a moment of tense, awkward intimacy that excludes the sights and sounds of the others in the changing room. We must all look completely naked to you, Anna suggests. Not completely, Fariba dryly remarks, pointing to Anna's hairnet. Now in complete silence, Fariba moves to pass by Anna. A series of over-the-shoulder shots from 2 rotating cameras are edited together rapidly, even as the silence intimates slowness, creating a brief sense of disorienting attraction and closeness as the pair gaze at each other. This sudden intimacy functions as a visual and oral interruption of the narrative that is proceeding to its seemingly inevitable conclusion of deportation. Fariba's remarks undo Islamophobic discourses that often reduce engagement with gender and Islam to assumptions about Muslim violence enacted via veiling and familial violence. The erotics of the scene, which is the first of several that will portray their unfolding relationship as friends and eventually lovers, briefly suspend the narrative tension that relies on the viewer's assumption that Fariba's hidden gender, quote unquote, will matter in the film, yet their intimacy is deeply precarious, as indicated by the encounter's context. It follows directly after a raid for undocumented workers and precedes a quote unquote joke when Fariba is grabbed by a coworker who shouts check for illegal workers. Intimate touch, in fact, is quickly intruded upon and interrupted by another, more violent touch that links personal xenophobia and state exclusion.
So we are intrigued by the possibilities for intimacy and solidarity that are raised in the scene and in many others in the films that we examine in our book. They point to what we describe as a dilemma that forms the central task of our book: how to recognize, affirm, and value intimacies, love, touch, and care, while at the same time challenging the racialized and gendered politics in which they are embedded. So how do we write about intimacy as a politically sustaining force while also acknowledging the fleetingness of intimate touch and the potential for violence that also is always part of these intimate encounters?
So we talk about precarious intimacies in the text from two perspectives. One is really as a set of aesthetic strategies. And these strategies for us really highlight the moments of intimacy and political possibility that these intimacies unfold, really as strategies in the face of violence and precarity, forms of sustenance. But they also make really visible the structures of violence in which they are embedded and the forces that produce precarity. At the same time, we're also thinking about it as a politics of reading. This is also really important to us in the text to think about how are the politics and aesthetics of intimacy represented on screen? How do we read intimacy politically? And how do we read for possibility, for political engagement and collectivities?
We chose this image that is a still from the wedding song on Les Chants des Mariés by French director Karine Albou, co-produced France and Tunisia from 2008. And this image, not only is it a beautiful image, but it also depicts these layers of violence that undercut intimacy here. The film is about intimate friendship between a Muslim and a Jewish teenager during the fascist attempts to occupy Tunisia. The depictions here are very layered. They're the effects of French colonialism and differential treatment of Jews and Muslims. There's also German anti-Semitism that plays into it, and the Holocaust. And that is sort of stands in tension with the tremendous love between these two that opens up many possibilities, but these possibilities are always cut short by the struggles that they're facing throughout the narrative and the film.
So this is our table of contents, and we'll talk just briefly about each chapter. We won't have time to go into depth about the films themselves, but at least we will allow some of our film stills here to stand in for the films a bit.
Yeah, the first chapter is entitled Touching Journeys, Precarious Intimacies and Narratives of Non-Arrival. And here you just see stills from the 4 films we're discussing in this chapter. We're looking here at precarious intimacies as they occur in disrupted or halted journeys. The spaces that we're looking at are populated by stories that intersect and people who touch each other's lives despite the isolation and also uncertainty produced in these spaces of non-arrival. The narrative expectation, of course, is the arrival in a safe space. And in these cases, this is all Europe. But that expectation is thwarted in all those 4 films. Simultaneously, though, the films tell stories of intimate connection and encounters that are possible in spite of, or sometimes even in the face of, European border regimes. The moments of intimate connection do not take place in Europe per se, but they are suspended in these spaces of non-arrival. There's really some interesting temporal shifts that also happen there in some of those films. And that means that such affinities and connections cannot be easily appropriated for narratives of a newly emergent or morally improved Europe. Europe in these films remains a space marked by exclusion based on colonialist histories and structures.
And the next chapter touches narrative disruption, race, gender, and queering intimacy. We're looking at films that, again, really defy the expectation that Europe in the 21st century produces inclusive spaces for queer intimacy and for refugee rights. And note that also, nevertheless, these films are films that really insist on the possibility of love and intimacy as a politically disruptive and personally sustaining force. The characters in these films all occupy precarious positions, particularly ones that are produced by insecure residency status, which intersects with economic insecurities. The queer intimacies in these films are deeply transformative and sustaining, but also are perceived by certain contexts in the film as dangerously unassimilable into the nation state or into Europe. Racism, including anti-Muslim racism, and persistent homophobia in Europe work against the possibilities for queer love, friendship, or family. But nevertheless, by claiming spaces really in the here and now of Europe, these characters construct precarious intimacies as queer spaces that cannot be appropriated, or at least not easily appropriated, for national or European agendas. And we really see here that these films are creating spaces in which subjects who are feeling, sensing subjects temporarily escape the isolating conditions of neoliberal precarity by forming attachments. And in spite of the fact that these attachments do not and cannot promise the so-called good life.
Our next chapter is entitled Religion, Gender, and Precarious Intimacy. And we start there from what we found, that cinematic representations of religion often really rely on heteronormative and also occasionally homonormative constructions of nuclear families. And we found that Karin Albu's films complicate the stories by showing the way in which intimacy and touch sometimes move in unexpected ways and contrary to the script as disruptive or even unexpected forces. So disruption in touch enables an imagination of new possibilities in these films, of solidarities that reach across difference, also religious difference, of care, of love that enable the same and enable the same. So what we found so interesting in these films, and also really kind of special and unique, is that religion opens up points of contact between the two protagonists, the two main protagonists in each of the films. Connections that enable them to explore their desire and their sexuality, but also draw attention to the forms of racism and violence that exacerbate the characters' vulnerable position and their respective societies. Their precarious intimacies are threatened by religion only insofar as the characters become targets of violence as members of their respective religious groups. So the precarious intimacies in these films are multiple and they're overlapping. They're intimacies of religion that also are closely tied to violent colonial structures, and then interpersonal relationships that are marked by the history of race and racism. And the films really grapple with this and negotiate religious intimacies as these sites where these kinds of tensions can be grappled with. And this sheds light on how Europe is a racialized space, but it also allows us to search for these moments and stories and images that pose challenges to this construction.
So in this next chapter, Commodified Intimacy in a Globalizing Europe, we are grappling with the question of how can we imagine productive intimacies when intimacies are so clearly embedded in colonial thought, in colonial histories, that also intersect with the racialized ideologies and the economic conditions that promote or even make necessary sex tourism, undervalued feminized care work, and so-called marriage migration. And these films for us, which are set in this case in Spain and in Belgium, stage diverging forms of intimacy and love that exist outside of the violent scripts in which these characters' lives exist, and really create ways to think, however momentary or imaginary, alternatives. We're looking here for solidarity in touch, friendship, community that reveal and work against the structures of power and violence. And in this particular chapter, thinking about acts of walking away, acts of refusal and defiance in the face of the commodification of intimacy becomes another way to think about one of the major topics in this book. So the tension between isolation and community as a feature of the precarious politics of intimacies within and beyond Europe. So the intimacies we describe in this chapter, the precarious intimacies we describe in this chapter, raise key questions about the complexities of conceptualizing sex and care work at a time when the valorization of choice and agency become ways of obscuring systems of power and violence. And to quote Hester Baer, quote, paradoxically, neoliberal policies create a situation of permanent insecurity that disproportionately affects minority groups, while at the same time, neoliberal discourses of individual choice, flexibilization, and mobility offer unprecedented opportunities for destabilizing normative roles and eroding traditional social formations in ways that appear empowering. So in this chapter for us, the violent histories and present structures of racialized and gendered exclusion render sustaining fantasies of neoliberal agency and choice impossible. The spaces of autonomy, of connection, and community for these characters are spaces that exist in spite of, and not because of, the European migration regimes and neoliberal forces that inform them. They can only be read against the narrative. These moments of friendship are temporary, fleeting, and at least within the narrative logic of the films, they cannot last.
I think it is very clear from our discussion so far, and also what Beverly was just saying, where those conjunctions are with Hester's work, and we definitely want to have enough time for discussion. So I'm going to make this discussion of this chapter short, and our final analysis chapter is called White Fragility and the White Gaze, Race, Gender, and Neoliberalism. And here you see stills from the films we're discussing in this chapter. And there we're looking at depictions of white women as kind of mainly emotional victims of capitalist modernity. But our argument is that this sort of whitewashes the dynamics of colonialist exploitation. Reading for Precarious Intimacies here, therefore, does not open any spaces for community and connection outside of the racialized gaze. On the contrary, it exposes the gender dynamics of racism. So our readings attempt to disrupt these dynamics. So we're trying to find these possible ways to not only expose the emotional stickiness of whiteness in these films and white femininity, but also the emotional charge as part of the violent politics of European racism. This means, to some extent, doing violence to the white characters in the films by reading them against their emotional charge. So this is our final chapter, and we have a final slide here on co-writing and collaborative thinking, but I think we can open up at this point for further question. I think I would love to hear more about open access publishing, about thinking through models of collaborative work and challenging sort of neoliberal contexts here. So thank you for listening to us, and I'm very excited to open for discussion at this point.
Also, let me just add, in my sort of distractedness, trying to manage my computers at the beginning, my gratitude to the organizers and for this opportunity to all discuss together.
Yeah, just maybe while people are formulating their questions, I just say one thing about open access, which is it was really important for me, given the topic of the book, to kind of like enact the critique that I was performing in the book by making sure this was published open access. And I just want to, like invite anyone to contact me at any time about how I worked this out. It was rather complicated. I mean, Amsterdam University Press has a really great emphasis on open access, and they on their end make it very easy to publish that way, but there is a fee involved, of course. So the tricky part is figuring out how to put that money together, and I found a lot of things in the course of working on this that could be helpful for other folks. So if if there's anyone out there who is thinking about publishing this way and wanting to learn a little bit more, I'd be happy to just like anecdotally explain to you how I got that money together from lots of different sources at my institution.
Yeah, and before we dive into the content, I'm just going to add here that in our case, it was a desire of ours. We also wanted this to be open access. We didn't exactly know how this was going to work, and it kind of, there was a completely coincidental situation where I was in a totally different meeting, and there was a digital projects librarian, somebody in the meeting. It was a Zoom meeting already. This was the beginning of the pandemic. And then she said that they had these grants for open access publishing. And we were just at the point when we could still make that decision. And I contacted her, and they just still had money. It's turning out that money is not there this year anymore. So these monies shift all the time. It's like these projects. Again, that's the neoliberal university in action, where suddenly there's money and suddenly the money's gone. So for my new book, I'm not clear where I'm going to find the money for that. So it's a complicated process, but for us it was sort of like, what? There's money? Okay, we'll take it. So
and let me just mention too that the project through which we were able to publish open access is called the Tome Project. So that might be something many of you, many universities have money available for a limited number of books through this project. I'll just
put it in here. It's Tome.
Wow, thank you so very much. It's no secret, it's not a secret that I'm a huge fan of your work and of both of the books. I think we have about 25 minutes allotted for conversation, Q&A, discussion. We'll even invite, comment, even if it's not a question. So if you if you have a question, you can post it in the chat, or if you'd like to ask the question or offer your perspective, you can raise your hand. There's a bit of a sort of small icon at the bottom of your screen that permits you to raise your hand, and I'll try to be as orderly about it as possible. Maybe before, to give you a chance to formulate, to get your thoughts together, I have very sort of generic, but maybe big picture questions by way of just inviting a conversation. Hester, I was so excited about this project, in particular, the point where you make, I'm trying to avoid using the word case, because you talked about it. Like you're not trying to say that Germany is a case study, but rather that it's somehow paradigmatic. In fact, a really important sort of like focal point to trace some of these broader processes. And I think that at the beginning of the talk, you were talking a little bit about you offered the American example as a sort of as a counter or a related process to this. And I was just wondering if you were in the book engaging with other, if you want to call it national traditions or other sort of like studies that engage this topic of neoliberalism broadly. A colleague of mine, Ignacio Sancho Prada, wrote a book on, neoliberalization of Mexican cinema. And, that's just an example. And I was wondering if there's anything that in those projects could be interesting with regard to some of your own interests in formulating the case for Germany.
Yes, thank you. I actually read Nacho's book. It's a great book on Mexican cinema and neoliberalism, and was very helpful for me in thinking through, the sort of, a lot of the forefront of scholarship on culture and neoliberalism is in the context of Latin American studies for, sort of obvious reasons of the really stark ways in which neoliberalism was sort of like imposed on Latin America as an experiment very early on, by some of these like US think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's not exactly what's going on in Mexico specifically, but his book is one of the most developed, I think, accounts of cinema and neoliberalism within a national context. A lot of the work that has been done on cinema and neoliberalism is really more on sort of like global cinema, world cinema, or sort of like transnational constellations. And I was really interested in like engaging very closely with the context of national cinema, also in order to problematize it from like a slightly different angle than the way it has been very importantly and successfully done, by many scholars of German film history, among many others. Anyway, yes, that like Nacho's book was very, very useful for me and important for me. Also, this book by Jonathan Buxbaum about French cinema called Exception Taken that I mentioned was very helpful for me in the early stages. Also because French cinema is a really completely opposite case to German cinema in terms of how the country has dealt with the context of globalization and neoliberalization. So yeah, thanks for this question, and I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. There's quite a lot to be said on it, and I don't want to hog it, but just by way of opening up the conversation a bit, maybe one question also for Maria and Beverly, and then we'll open it up for, I see there's a lively chat conversation going on. I haven't had a chance to open up yet, so just full disclosure. So Maria and Beverly, we saw a bunch of the examples that illustrate some of the points that you're making in the individual chapters, and you've gone into a couple of sort of like more details with regard to the point you're making. I was wondering if you wanted to go into another example that you haven't had a chance to discuss in detail, particularly with regard to this point of, I don't know if you would call it a certain sense of stuckness with regards to these aesthetics of, on the one hand, intimacy being foregrounded or being made available at the same time as it seems there's all these like social structures and otherwise that are trying to suppress it. So I see, and I know you see a great deal of potential in there, as quite liberatory potential perhaps, but I also see a certain kind of stuckness to it. It's as though this intimacy feels entirely entrapped. And I know this is part of the project of yours to illustrate how this pans out. And I was wondering if you wanted to maybe turn to an example or just kind of talk to this point broadly.
I think that so many of the films, especially in the first two chapters, have characters who are deported, and that's an important part of sort of the narrative of the film. And I think it was really important for us to emphasize moments and feelings against the narrative structure of the film, and to recognize that if we're going to look at our politics of reading, it does something to focus on those moments against that broader inevitable I mean, it's not inevitable, but the narrative that feels inevitable in context of current migration regimes. So that's just one thing that comes to mind, Maria.
Yeah, I was trying to think of specific examples, but I think that's hard because sometimes people don't know exactly the films. But I was actually just teaching this film again for Moment Freedom. There are many of these. So there's, for example, one scene when two of the main characters are thinking that they've made it and they've tricked the border regime, and they're in the train as they're crossing, I think, the Hungarian border into Germany, or into Austria, and they're dancing and they're, you know, and starting to sing in the train car. And it's like that moment of joy and intimacy is then, you know, and as a viewer, you're sort of emotionally, it's a very clearly affectively charged scene, and you think, okay, they made it, right? That's the narrative expectation of the film, and then, or that's the expectation of arriving, you know, the arrival, and then the immigration officers actually come back, and it turns out that they have caught that he has a fake passport, and he gets arrested, and one of the characters is deported, and only one of them keeps going, and the other one is being sent back with actually deadly consequences, like in the film. So what I'm meaning there is to describe the scene is, I agree with you actually, Ervin. I think this is, we're not just trying to say, oh yes, right, here are these moments, but we are also saying that these very moments are highlighting those regimes. They're there to show like the possibility, and then they're there very much to show how it's foreclosed. You know, in these violent moments and moves. So yeah, I wanted to, just because Hester did a shout out also, I also wanted to mention another book that I think this group will also be interested in and probably knows about, but Claudia Brega's Making Worlds is also came out in 2020, and it's a little bit of a different focus, but it's also I think would connect to some of these books really well. And the subtitle is Affect and Collectivity in Contemporary European Cinema. So that book just kind of came out as we are finishing our book. So I think the conversation has to happen now. But yeah, just want to mention that.
Thank you so much. You know, I was fearing this would happen the moment we bring up the open access matter. Now we have a full conversation around open access, which I really appreciate. I want to put out there, but I do want to bring us back to these fantastic books, and I want to invite you to participate in a conversation. If you have any questions about the presentation, the books themselves, go ahead and put the question in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll be glad to get to it. Maria?
There's a question by Sebastian actually in the chat that I actually also had for Hester. So I would love for you to see if you have anything to say about that. He has a question for us too, Beverly. But the question for you, Hester, is I'm curious about the changing role of German public television in the financing of films, and also the new neoliberal production and distribution powerhouses like Netflix, Amazon, etc., and their impact on German cinema. Obviously, that's not what your book is about, but I think it's just such an interesting question that we're all sort of confronting at this moment. I wonder what you think about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I spend quite a bit of time in the book thinking about the specific production contexts, who finance different kinds of films and how and why. So it's maybe like too much detail to kind of go into here, because it's a very complex landscape, as you all know, in terms of putting together the financing for feature films in Germany. And television, of course, public television is almost always a player there. You know, one thing that I try to work out is how that role of the sponsorship of television has changed in the era of neoliberalization, and particularly via attention to the Berlin School of Filmmaking and the way that Berlin School films, I find them like these very interesting kind of neoliberal assemblages in the sense that they are, you know, making visible and shedding light in very important, critical ways on like through production style and form and narrative content as well, on the kind of situation produced by late capitalism and also globalization, like within the diegesis of the films, at the same time that they're creating this very kind of like successful transnational intermedial model of kind of navigating the changed mediascape of the present. And so like they do rely on this public television funding. They have like vanishingly small audiences in Germany, but are like blockbusters on the global film festival circuit. And then in most cases, they end up getting picked up by Netflix and Amazon or whatever, some, you know, streaming media platforms that are operating in different places. And sort of the like, I argue that the style and the content of the films is from the beginning kind of like deliberately organized for that global dissemination. So they're really like relying on the context of the streaming media platforms, and the way that they have kind of like embraced play with genre is a big part of that. So that is like something that I talk about in the book. I don't get into in the book very much the topic of you know, Netflix and so forth. I mean, partly because I was writing this book a little bit before that, before Netflix opened up in Germany, for example, and the end date of the book is 2010, in part because at some point I just had to like pull the plug on all the new developments in the context of neoliberalization and like just say this is going to be the end and I don't do anything after that. But I'm working now with Jill Smith on a co-edited volume about Babylon Berlin, and you can, you know, hopefully look for that soon. We have a piece that just came out that starts to like think about this. I think in the same special issue of Europe Now that Beverly and Maria, you both have a piece that appeared in as well. That's just published online, open access as well, so you all can check that out. But in the project about Babylon Berlin, we're really interested in thinking through like very much more sort of critically and systematically across a range of different sort of topics and registers, like using Babylon Berlin as a case study for how this changed landscape of streaming media operates, and what the implications of that are for thinking about sort of like German audiovisual production in the context of the present.
Thanks so much. Maria, Beverly, would you like to take Sebastian's question for you? So could you talk a little bit about the refugee crisis of 2015 and how that might have an impact on European filmmaking, particularly in the context of some of your ideas?
I would just say really quickly that I think there's always something that feels like it was a recent crisis, right? And so the perception of crisis in 2015, it may not have changed much, because before 2015, there was a perception that refugee migration was increasing. It was already experienced as a crisis. It just, that crisis framing just got shifted a little bit after 2015 to be about 2015, right? But that crisis existed, that perception of crisis existed before then. And of course, the people for whom it's really a crisis are the people that are migrating, right? But you know, this there are different times in which refugee migration is more of quote unquote the crisis, right? We had that moment in the early 90s where that was really emphasized, and then other forms or other markers of migration were emphasized differently, markers around Islam, for example. But I don't, for me, that's not going to change much, because it's more about how the discourse of crisis keeps going.
Yeah, just also very briefly, I agree. And I think that obviously we wrote the book in light of that new and old crisis discussion. So the discussions that were coming out of the media and also scholarly discussions at the time influenced some of what we were thinking. So it's interesting though that the films or some of the films we're talking about in different ways do speak to that, to these discourses, like around Willkommenskultur and sort of the way in which then certain kind of European myths are created around these crises. So I do think that the films still like speak to that, and that's partially to Beverly's point that it's not really different, right? It's not that new. It's just sort of, yeah.
Even just as an anecdote, even the notion of welcome culture is something that emerged in, I think it was 2011, 2012, when certain, in a completely, I don't know, I can't even think of the right word for what's happening here, but offices for, that are also responsible for deportation were renamed as welcome offices for migration in this attempt to make migration to, it was a sort of pilot project and then never really took hold, but this existed before 2015.
Thanks so much. There's a couple of questions now. I think we're really getting started with this. So Jen was next, had her hand up. Jen, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this, all super interesting. I have a ton of questions, but you don't need to answer all of them. I'm interested in the way that film in a way becomes global, but at the same time, at least in my experience, geo-blocking is real. And in order to, in order to access, Amazon kind of, for example, to take one example, recreates national publics because in order to, get around geo-blocking, you have to VPN and so forth, which is just not the same thing as just turning on your Netflix. So that kind of re-inscription of national borders through corporate conglomerates, I think is an interesting topic that you might want to talk about or not. And then two questions that are more specific to the books, both of which are just lots of cool ideas coming off of it. I just was wondering, Hester, with your idea, the way that you define neoliberalism, I wonder, are you saying that before there, like in better times, there actually was less subsumption of the world, by commodification and or is that just like our recollection of how it was, or was it actually the case that all cinema, even when it was publicly funded and so forth in West Germany, and even when the state of East Germany supported DEFA and so forth, whether that it's still actually at the bottom, maybe this is like a vulgar Marxist way of thinking about it, but like that it's actually at the bottom about funding and about money. And then that's just, you can answer or not. And then for Beverly and Maria, recently I've been thinking about friction and as opposed to global flows. And I was thinking about the status of touch because on one hand, it feels to me like often, I guess that like the melodramatic genre, which is so common, the moment that we, get as viewers a kind of a, like a catharsis because the two characters touch, because also the way that cinema works, it's harder to be in the interiority of the people, so of the character. So when they're touching, that's like our kind of moment of catharsis. And so I wonder, is there something special about touch as opposed to other ways of characters being together, and does it have then a special status that's different than the way that melodrama would tend to work, where you have the personal story against the backdrop or related to the larger tensions that are going
on? Okay, I'll just, there's a lot there, Jen, as you said, but I'll just say a couple of things.
Yeah, just whatever you want to deal with.
Really good. I mean, I think the topic of geo-blocking and the way that national communities are reinforced by corporate, policies around what is accessible and not is obviously a huge topic, and I think a really important one. So you're absolutely right to mention it, and that's a topic that we take up directly in the Babylon Berlin work. And that I don't talk about as much in this book. Of course, filmmaking is always about money. The bottom line is always money. And so, I mean, if I understood the question right, you know, like you're absolutely right. I want to underline that this is not like a nostalgia project for, oh, the times were better in, you know, in the 20th century or whatever. Like in certain ways for filmmaking they were, and in certain ways they really weren't. So like, you know, that is not a nostalgia project at all. But what I'm trying to do is really think through the differential ways that state sponsorship enables certain forms of representation to emerge, and where that, you know, what then is disallowed or disenabled by the context of financialization. And, you know, it's I'm not saying somehow like everything that has transpired since 1980 is worse than everything that came before. Not by a long shot. It's really a lot about tracing kind of paradoxes and contradictions and ambivalences and complexities, and trying to think specifically about the role that that money and financing plays within that, considering the fact that in order to finance a feature film, you know, you have to have really a lot of money, no matter what kind of feature film it is. And you know, especially if you want that film to reach audiences. And so just kind of like working through that idea along a range of registers, including how the films themselves often build in kind of like metacritical attention to this topic of money and time and money in filmmaking, and how that starts to change in the course of this 40-year period that I'm tracking is like a lot of the kind of what the nitty-gritty of this project is about. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but hopefully it gets there some way.
Yeah, I love the way that you just talked about the self-referential. I really like that in your analysis. But what I actually wanted to say is it's a little bit an answer to Jennifer's question about touch, but it also maybe answers or touches on some of the questions in the chat, like Birgit and Olivia's question that are more about aesthetics. So Beverly and I, when we really started this project, we were really interested in touch itself. But it very quickly became clear that it didn't quite work in the way that we thought. Like what was interesting to us, we couldn't address by focusing on these moments. First of all, that there's the complexity and the ambivalence in it that Hester's talking about, and then there are many different ways in which touch can play out. There's also violent touch. There's not only intimate touch, right? And intimacies can be, so like we just very quickly understood that focusing on these moments in the film is not really helpful for what we're trying to develop theoretically and politically. And then also the way in which this plays out in the film, I can't exactly answer the question of aesthetics in any general way, because it plays out very differently in the different films. So in some films, touch is absolutely rare, or it almost doesn't happen at all, which then makes these moments when it almost happens, or when there is even a possibility for touch to happen, very precious. And the camera, of course, directs that, and that's a very conscious narrative strategy. And in other films, there's an emphasis on skins and touching skins and actually filming that in close-ups. So aesthetically, that plays out very differently. So that, again, shows we needed a broader strategy to approach the question. Does that maybe answer some of this? I love the questions. I think they're really great and make me revisit some of that, what we were trying to do. Beverly maybe has something to add here.
I think that covers it all. I think the only thing I would just briefly mention is that touch is almost never cathartic in these films, because it's immediately followed by moments of violence that intervene from the outside of the intimate relationships.
Thank you very much. There have been some great questions also in chat, and I've saved a bunch of this stuff, so I'll invite the authors to respond outside of this setting if that's necessary. So I'll be sure to send you those questions. I want to thank you three for your fantastic presentations. And I want to thank the audience too for the patience and the dedication to your excellent presentations as well. I think to me this is good community, and I think I'm hoping we can kind of carry it forward somehow, and I know we will actually. But if you'd like to be in some capacity or another involved in a network, just want to post again a link to our website. You can sign up there for a listserv. We invite you to be part of these roundtables. If you have forthcoming work in any capacity, just reach out to Zoran and I. And on this note, I just want to again note that this event was recorded and that I will be sure to share it with everyone who is here and everyone who signed up. There were a lot of people who wanted to participate but couldn't for some reason. So we'll know that our community is much larger and reaches beyond what is available here. So thank you again once more for your fantastic work. Thank you to the audience for their questions and participation. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day as well as a fabulous weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.